This course is a continuation of exploring courses about .NET Core and ASP.NET Core. Parts 1 to 3 were an exploration of the core of .NET Core, what .NET Core is all about, including ASP.NET. And I talked about the foundations of application libraries, including ASP.NET Core. And what I did there is I built a simple console application, starting with something that just displays Hello World, and then developed it into a full-fledged, albeit simple, ASP.NET Core application. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to build on .NET Core to explore ASP.NET Core. I'm really going to be focusing on ASP.NET Core here. And in particular, what's new, different, and exciting about it. Essentially, I'm going to be giving you a detailed distillation of what's new so that you have a feel for all the new moving parts and you can get up to speed with it fairly quickly. Now, as with the previous parts of the course, I'm going to assume that you're familiar with classic ASP.NET and MVC applications, including using C#. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of comparisons about how things were built in ASP.NET, classic ASP.NET, so that you can better understand what's going on with ASP.NET Core. Now, if you don't have the background with classic ASP.NET, don't worry about it. That's not going to be a major thing that I'm going to be focusing on. But if you are, I'll try to point out where things are a little bit different. Okay, now, before we get going, I want to give you one caution. Beware of outdated core information. I've talked previously about how the development of ASP.NET Core and .NET Core were a little bit tortuous. It was a little bit like watching sausage being made, but I don't really think that's a criticism of Microsoft. Well, I'll say it's not a criticism of Microsoft. The problem really is they were completely transparent about the process. A lot of ASP.NET Core is open source, and so you could watch it being made. They were very open with blog posts and podcasts and things like that to talk about the process and where they were and so forth. The downside now to that is that if you're looking for information about how to use, say, view components within ASP.NET Core, if you're not careful, you may find older articles that bear very little relationship to how things actually happen with ASP.NET Core. And I'll even talk about a few features, particularly the project.json files versus MS Build, that are still being changed and morphing and developing, even well after the initial release of ASP.NET Core and some updates. So things are still changing. The problem, of course, is that all too often blog post authors and people that do videos don't mention what version of the software they're working with. And so if they were working with a release candidate, first release candidate actually was pretty much scrapped and had some major overhauls done to it. And so if you're reading something that is related to that, it's the actual .NET Core released versions ended up being in some very substantial ways quite different. So just be aware of that. And in particular, if you see anything that references ASP.NET 5, forget about that article, because ASP.NET 5 is way back, probably the first year of their development of the new technologies, when they were thinking in terms of it being the next version of ASP.NET. The problem is that ASP.NET Core is fundamentally different from ASP.NET. There's a lot that's similar, as you'll see, but it's quite different. And so anything that references ASP.NET 5 just isn't going to be updated information. But unfortunately, they started using the ASP.NET Core name early enough that if you're reading an article that even uses that name, doesn't mean that it's current for the release version. So that's just a big heads up. Be aware. If things just don't look like what you're seeing, look at the date on the article and try to see if there's clues within it to see whether that article is about an earlier version. And of course, Microsoft is continuing to release new versions. And so it's quite possible that what you're using, there's been new releases, even with the released versions of the software, since that article or that video was made. Okay, so just a big heads up on that. The last preliminary thing I want to do before I get into the meat of ASP.NET Core is talk very briefly about the tools that I use in this course. Okay, so of course, you're going to need the .NET Core SDK. I'm using version 1.1.0 in this course. The earlier parts of the course used versions 1.0.1. Now, there may be a later version available when you're viewing the course, but really all the principles that I talk about here should still apply. As I mentioned, there's still a lot of changes being made, and Microsoft is adding a lot of features, but there's relatively few things that they're really changing that are fundamentally different. And like as I mentioned a moment ago, there's one in particular that I'll talk about shortly. Okay, now I'll also be using Visual Studio. I'll be using a combination of Visual Studio 2015 and Visual Studio 2017, the release candidate version of that. Both of these have all of the latest updates. Now, with the release of 2017, there are some fundamental changes to the project structure of ASP.NET Core applications, and I'll take a look at those. Now, I am using the community editions of both of these versions of Visual Studio. That has everything you need to get started, build some very robust, very substantial applications. You don't necessarily need professional, you don't need the Ultimate Edition and Enterprise Edition and all the heavyweight editions. Those have a lot of really nice features for application development, particularly large, complex applications that a lot of developers are working on. But at the level that I'm talking about the technologies, the free community editions work just fine. And then I'll also occasionally use Visual Studio Code. Really, I'm just going to be using it here as a glorified text editor. But if you haven't checked out this cross-platform tool from Microsoft, it's really a nice editor. It's a step up from a plain text editor without all the bloated overhead, albeit some incredibly useful bloated overhead of Visual Studio. And the nice thing there too is that it's free. Okay, now anything with the name Visual Studio up until fairly recently meant Windows. But you're also going to encounter a version of Visual Studio for the Mac. Now this, strictly speaking, isn't a port of Visual Studio from Windows to the Mac. It's actually a port of some, well, not really a port, but a version of the Xamarin tools that Microsoft bought back in, I think it was 2016, that they bought that company and got this editor that's somewhat cross-platform, but specifically they're releasing it for the Mac. That's going to be pretty different from the Visual Studio that I'm using here. There may be all the features that you need, but it's just so new enough that there's no way to tell yet. Okay, and then the last thing is that I'll be using the .NET Core tooling that is part of Visual Studio. Now in this course, I'm using Visual Studio 2015, 2017, as I mentioned, with all the latest updates to these. But future versions of Visual Studio will have the same kind of support for .NET and ASP.NET Core projects. But it is still pre-release. I don't know when Microsoft is going to release the final version of it, but I expect that what I'm going to be showing you is going to be substantially the same, with one exception, which is MS Build, that I'll talk about a little bit later in the course. All right, so just be aware that there may be some changes, but even after they release the first version, and you're watching this course and there's been additional released versions, some of the tooling is going to be different as it develops. We're still fairly early in this technology. There may be some changes, but I don't expect that there'll be anything so radically different that you won't be able to figure out how to do it in later versions for quite a while. Okay, so let's start talking about ASP.NET Core. There's a few things that you need to understand, and this is a bit of a refresher from earlier parts in the course. But now that I'm going to really be focusing on ASP.NET Core, I'm not really going to be talking about .NET Core by itself all that much in the remaining parts of this course. But I want to make sure that you understand the context of what ASP.NET Core is all about. And you just need to lay a foundation for our exploration of ASP.NET Core. So the first thing to understand is that ASP.NET Core is not the next version of ASP.NET. It is the successor, but it's not the next evolutionary step. So again, I'll be repeating this over and over, particularly in context when I talk about features that look an awful lot like what were available in ASP.NET, particularly the MVC features, classic ASP.NET that is. But this was a complete rewrite from the ground up. So just keep that in mind. If you conceptually try to make everything within ASP.NET Core work the way that you learned it worked in ASP.NET, and particularly MVC specifically, then you're probably going to get a little bit frustrated, because that was certainly the situation I was in, particularly back when they were calling it ASP.NET 5. So I'm so glad they changed the name. I kind of wish they had dropped the ASP.NET, because it really is a new animal. But apparently Microsoft just felt that there was so much mind share around ASP.NET that they couldn't get rid of that. At least they changed it to be version 1.0 of the new ASP.NET. Okay, it's currently released and supported, but it's not yet complete. Microsoft, it's definitely version 1. There's actually been some updates, some fairly substantial updates to what was initially released as version 1.0, but it's still not yet complete. It's probably going to take a couple more years until ASP.NET Core is complete. So there's missing features, and I talked a fair amount about this in earlier parts of this course, where right now it may not be appropriate for new development projects if you need features that just aren't there yet. But I've found that it's feature complete for many of the applications that I've done, and so I'm quite happily plugging away and using it. You know, it is released software, it's supported software, so don't be worried about that. But there's a lot of features that Microsoft is going to be continuing to add to it over the coming months and at least a couple of years. You'll see some reference to this, but it's based on the .NET Standard specification, of which .NET Core is a reference implementation, and it's cross-platform. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this too much here, because I covered it in earlier parts of the course to a decent extent. But just understand that when you see the reference to .NET Standard, that's a specification, and .NET Core is an implementation of that, and a cross-platform implementation of it to boot. Okay, classic ASP.NET still with us and is going to be for a very long time. It's still supported. Microsoft isn't going to be putting quite as much development effort into it as they have over the last 15 years, well, really going on 20 years. But it's still supported, the full .NET framework. If you're developing on Windows or for Windows applications, it's still with us, it's still supported, it's still going to get love from Microsoft for quite a long time. So if you have a lot of applications that you've written in ASP.NET MVC, and they're working fine, you can continue to enhance them. There may be some point where you want to make the conscious decision to migrate them to ASP.NET Core. That's going to be quite a job, because there is a lot that is different. You have to do a lot of manual work. There really isn't an obvious, clear migration path from classic ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core. And there probably never will be. Microsoft may come up with something sometime, just as it listens to customers who want to migrate it. But this is a different web development technology. A lot of your code is going to be reusable, but a lot of it's not going to be. And if you try to reuse it, in a lot of cases, it's just the wrong approach to doing things within ASP.NET Core. Now, all that said, you can, to a large extent, have ASP.NET Core running right next to ASP.NET. But it's going to take some work to accomplish getting that done. So just be aware of that. And there's lots of documentation, lots of discussion about those kinds of features. And then finally, if you're not comfortable with NuGet, don't know what it is, it's a package manager from Microsoft, you want to get comfortable now, because .NET Core and ASP.NET Core are both built on NuGet packages. When you first create a project from a Visual Studio template, one of the first things that Visual Studio is going to do is refresh the project and download all of the packages that are already an integral part of just the core features of that application before you even start adding custom code or adding your own packages or expanding them and so forth. So you're going to want to get comfortable with finding packages, how you install them within Visual Studio, and how you see them and how you work with version dependencies and so forth. You don't need to spend a huge amount of time. You don't need to get real intimately familiar with the down and dirty details of NuGet, but you need to understand what's going on and how to work with packages, particularly within Visual Studio, and all the more so if you're developing applications using text editors, including Visual Studio Code. There is support for NuGet in Visual Studio Code, but you're a little bit closer to the metal when you're working in those kinds of environments. So you need to get comfortable with them now.